everyone, my name is Srijita Bhattacharya. I'm a third year English honors student, and through this video lecture, I am going to talk about the Beat generation, alternatively called as the Beat movement, and sort of give you a little bit of a background as to why this literary movement is important, when it came into being, the kind of works that came into being during this period, and the famous names of this generation. Before we get into what the literary movement was about, it is important to understand why it exactly happened. Let's keep in mind that the 1950s is a decade which is remembered as the most defining of the 20th century, and especially for America, where the Beat movement first took place. Um, After the disillusionment of the World War II, with humankind having witnessed the greatest possible horrors of history, including the Holocaust, America witnessed a considerable economic growth, but also extremely important political and social changes. Now, what exactly were these socio-political changes? The civil rights movement picked up. The Korean War took place. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States happened. Famous cases like the Brown versus Board of Education and Rosa Parks' famous refusal to give her bus seat up to a white man came into light. Let's keep in mind that it is against this intense socio-political backdrop that the Beat poets emerged. Now, who exactly were these Beats? The Beats were originally a bunch of unpublished friends and later became one of the most significant sources of contemporary counterculture. Their poetry flourished in the late 1940s and 1950s, and the heart of the movement was in San Francisco of the 1950s, even though the beginning stages were in New York. The Beat poets rebelled against conventions of mainstream American writing, and it is because of the themes that they included in their poetry, in their works, that uh, these contents helped bring liberal publishing to the United States. The Beats considered the fact that the kind of literature and poetry that was being taught to them in the 1950s had become obsolete, that following the disillusionment of the post-war period, such literature, such poetry was not relevant anymore. Hence, they talked about topics that were very taboo, that were vulgar, considered obscene, ungodly during the times that they were writing in. Let's also keep in mind the fact that this is the time when sodomy laws had been passed and homosexuality is considered illegal. The Beats wrote about things that drove them, that filled them with passion. Most of the themes that they were concerned with included sexual liberation, transgression, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, experimentation with Eastern religions. In fact, most of the Beat poets were openly gay, a very unheard fact at that time. Because they were so against convention, Beat poets mostly wrote in free verse and rejected formalism in poetry completely. What exactly is formalism? Formalism is nothing but poetry written in verse. It has a meter and usually has a rhyme scheme. Now, to put it in a very layman language, formalist poetry seems very disciplined, like it has a set of rules, a set of literary conventions to adhere to. And that is exactly what the Beats were against. Works of famous Beat poets like Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and even Allen Ginsberg, one of the most famous Beat poets of his times, and a very famous poet who later had an active participation in the hippie movement a decade later, wrote about themes like nature, sex, drugs, and jazz. I must point out here that beat poetics and jazz have many evident similarities between them, and the beats were overwhelmingly influenced by the musicians of the 1940s and 1950s. Elements that jazz music and beat poetry shares include spontaneity of the writing, the focus of breath in a line, etc. The original movement can be traced back to the grounds of Columbia University, where William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jacques Kerouac formed the trio of friends who became the face of the movement initially. Along with poets like Lucien Carr and others, they talked about the need for a new vision, which is a term originally coined by William Butler Yeats, a very famous modernist poet, to rebel against what they considered the conservative, formalistic literary ideals of their professors. They believed that the kind of literature, the kind of poetry that was being taught to them is not relevant anymore, especially in the post war period. Seminal works of beat literature include Howl and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg, The Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, which deals with the control of consciousness and behavior through addiction to power, money, drugs, sex, etc., and Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which was a defining work based on the travels of Kerouac and his friends across the United States. Let's take an example of a very famous beat poem, I Am 25 by Gregory Corso. Let me narrate it to you. With a love, a madness for Shelley, Chatterton, Rimbaud, and the needy yap of my youth has gone from ear to ear, I hate old poetmen, especially old poetmen who retract, who consult other poetmen, who speak their youth in whispers, saying, I did those then, but that was then, that was then. Oh, I would quiet old men. Say to them, I'm your friend. What you once were, through me, you'll be again. Then at night, in the confidence of their homes, rip out their apology tongues and steal their poems. So the poem is very self explanatory in a way that it straight away begins with an allusion to Shelley, Chatterton, and Rimbaud, P.B. Shelley, Thomas Chatterton, and Rimbaud, who are poets who died very young. Shelley died at 29, Thomas Chatterton committed suicide at 17, and Rimbaud died at 37, which is a relatively young age to die. The speaker absolutely hates old poetmen because he will one day become an old poet man. And he sort of despises these poets because they do not have the same passion and vigor that they once had. They are not passionate about their youth and they do not romanticize it anymore. Although the speaker wants to prolong his youth, Corso recognizes the fate of all humans, that's old age, and more importantly, an acceptance of it, whether to be reluctant or to be submissive, and there's a desperate wish of remaining ever young, even if it is done ignorantly. All right, that's all for today. I hope that made sense. I hope I was able to give you a little bit of a background about the Beat movement, the Beat generation, and talk about the philosophy of these poets that are so important to the history of English literature. Thank you, and I'll see you again in the next lecture.